he begins to question, like, what am I doing? I can't do it anymore. God says, okay, well, I'll divide up some of the responsibilities to the 70. And he had already taken Jethro's advice and had set up kind of a court system, from the petty things like Johnny looked at me funny, to the big things which Moses would decide. So, and then we talked about the people complained again, and the quail comes, and it was probably the type of quail that is native to the Mediterranean there, but there was a plague that happened for greed and gluttony. It said that it almost like covered the ground like 3 feet deep in quail. And we speculated, was the plague somewhat a natural plague? Was it, bird flu type of thing? Could have been, we don't know. It doesn't have to be a natural thing, God could have. And so, but there was definitely greed. They ate so much of it came out their nose, which is gross. The Bible doesn't stop being honest about things. And like I said, it reminded me of when you were in junior high and the kids at the table would start laughing after they drink some milk and the milk comes out their nose. So then we talked about Numbers 12. Aaron and Miriam turn on him. There's sibling rivalry. You got to remember, they're in their 80s. You hadn't heard much about Miriam since she saved baby Moses. And I'm sure she held that over his head. Just remember what I did for you, brother. You've never done that for anybody. And then we did hear later when she led the women out with tambourines, and we will sing unto the Lord after they crossed the Red Sea. But it's very sad that all they had been through, and still they're doing that. Now, Aaron seems to be kind of a bystander again, He's kind of real pliable. Oh, Miriam's saying that. He's saying, yeah, that's right, Moses shouldn't have married this woman, this Cushite woman. We talked about that. And so apparently Zipporah has died. Or she never came back. She'd gone with Jethro and never came back. We don't know. But a Cushite woman would have been from Africa. Whether she was, black, we don't know. But Moses kind of took it in stride. Moses was meek. Moses was special. And God treated him as special. And he says, you know what? You're not going to talk about Moses that way. And we talked about that Miriam is listed first on the complaint, not Aaron, which I think was significant. Also, apparently the verb used in Hebrew to describe the complaint is feminine in nature. So she's probably behind it, the big sister. And once again, Aaron shows kind of his weakness. And we're going to see more of that. So then Miriam gets struck with leprosy. And we have one of the shortest prayers in the Bible. Right away, Moses said, Lord, heal her. And he does. But God says, even if her father had spit on her, she would have to be outside of the camp for 7 days. So they set up a tent for her outside of the camp. And she stays there for 7 days. I'm sure she did a lot of soul searching during that time. Yeah. She was saying,
Probably shed a few tears.
And shed a few tears. Hopefully she was repentant.
Tears of remorse or repentance.
Right, yeah.
This is different.
Right. Well, hopefully it did get her attention. I'm sure it did. both getting the leprosy and getting healed. She probably thought better of Moses after that, when Moses prays for her and she gets healed.
Sometimes sibling rivalry is not taken care of early in life. I mean, you see families,
There you go.
that stuff grows.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. So, sometimes we don't improve with age.
I was gonna say, we've learned already, like many times in what we've read, that you don't grow in wisdom just because you're old.
Yeah. I remember when our kids were little, we went to a nursing home, the Two Rivers Nursing Home by our house down in Anoka. And so we kind of adopted some older people there. And for some reason, my mindset was, all of these people are just going to be sweet old people, you know, in their rocking chairs.
And they're not.
And they're not. The first time I visited this one guy, who was a very interesting story, he had rode the rails during the Depression. I'm really getting off, but and he had lived in a sod house in Nebraska. You know, he had all these stories, but he was paralyzed from one side because of a stroke. He was really friendly and really appreciative. The guy in the next to him, roommate, he was nuts. You know, he had a belt around him, and he hollers at me, "Give me a knife! I gotta cut this off." You know, and I go, "No."
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Anyways, so yeah, it's not always, you know, a perfect match, right? So Numbers 13, we talked about the spies. It's interesting, whose plan was it? You know, like J. Vernon McGee will say, the Bible explains the Bible. The Bible is the best commentary on the Bible. So you look in Deuteronomy, and it really indicates that what happened is that the people wanted it, and God went along with it. And the reason they were saying we got to have these 12 spies, and the key point is to see if what God said is really true. I think that was the motivation. There was a lack of faith there. They weren't believing. God had already told them, listen, it's land flowing with milk and honey. I got rid of all the Egyptians. I can certainly handle the Canaanites. But they didn't believe it. And so they picked 12 men. And they were leaders. I mean, these were well-respected guys. And of course, we know Joshua was from Ephraim and Caleb was from Judah. Those are the only two guys that we ever remember the names of. The other guys we don't remember because they didn't last long after the fact. So, like Psalms 106 says that God sent leanness to their souls. Yeah.
Been working that way for years, you remember the winners, not the losers.
Yeah, yeah. But it also shows that, and we watched a little video summary of their journey. So going on to the lesson today then in chapter 13. So the spies went out, and we're going to get to just how far they really traveled, which I think is interesting. But one of the things was the sons of Anak. Now, Anak was a giant. There seemed to have been a race of giants. How big they actually were, you know, it depends on what a cubit is. But on the back of your sheet, you know, you have a modern day 8'11" giant with a picture. That's Robert Pershing Wadlow, the tallest man in modern history. He was a pituitary giant. He was born in normal height. He had a pituitary tumor that caused him to grow. And you can see that he was a little bit head and shoulders above the rest.
So are these other people normal height?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, he would not have been a scary guy. Notice he has a cane. He died when he was like in his 28 or 27, something like that, for a lot of multiple health problems. You know, just the heart having to work, the circulation, getting it all over. So I don't think these guys were pituitary giants. I think they were, you know, genetically proportioned to be like, and I was talking to Steve about this, you know, even if they were Shaquille O'Neal size, that was a giant back then. I mean, most of those men in that era were maybe, you know, 5'5", 5'6", I don't know, something like that. So if you have a 7'2", you know, 300-pound Shaquille O'Neal come after you, it's gonna look. I'd be a little bit afraid. I wouldn't want to go one-on-one with Shaquille O'Neal or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Like where does a 7'8" and pound gorilla sleep
Yeah.
anywhere he wants to?
Yeah. So that was, you know, and they had encountered other giants too, even before they got into the land. There was a guy, and the Bible was descriptive of how big his bed was even, you know, it was huge. You know, and it was made out of iron, you know, and it wasn't a sleep number bed either. But it's interesting, the Bible puts in some of those details. Now, before the flood, there were giants too, but they would have died in the flood. And we know that from Scripture.
I wonder how much genetic was passed into Noah's family before, you know, carried through. Possibility
Yeah.
could have been.
And there might have been some mutations that took place that caused some of these men to develop that way. And of course, before the flood, there's other things too, you know, where angels were involved, fallen angels. But that's another story. So God had already said about the land, it was going to be good. Why else would God have brought you out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea and gone through the wilderness if he wasn't going to provide for you? So then you have the minority and the majority reports. There's that children's song, 10 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. Okay. So the 10 said, they added the one word, but. Whenever you're hearing a story and somebody says, but, you know there's something else coming that's probably negative. So the emphasis should have been, God is with us, so have courage and do not be afraid to do what is right. In Joshua 1:9, it says, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid, don't be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Well, before deciding how to mount a military campaign against the existing inhabitants of Canaan, Moses wanted an accurate, up-to-date information about the settlements and their fortifications. Okay, well that's reasonable. And to gain this, he sent they were undercover agents, okay? They probably said, okay, let's dress like the Canaanites, you know, I don't. I'm sure if they had been caught, they would have been killed. But they had a 6-week mission to secure details about the defenses of the town and the cities that could become future military targets. So they were leaders, and they went from Beersheba and Hebron, Dan, Damascus, and also some of the places they mentioned. They searched it from south to north and back again. Now this is interesting. A distance of about 250 miles each way for 40 days. Wow. They must have been in good shape.
And it's not all flat land either.
No,
Mountains.
and there's probably not water everywhere either. I don't know. although the land of Canaan at that time was a lot more fertile than it is today. You know, it kind of got wrecked in the last, 3,000 years. So this guy wrote, the spies traveled north secretly from the desert of Zin beyond Beersheba, and that's where Isaac had settled 300 years earlier. Interesting. So some of these have been names of places they had been before. And on past Shechem, that's where Jacob had set up an altar and bought land for a tomb. Interesting. And from here they continued north to Rehum and Lebo, Hamath Pass in the far north of Canaan near Damascus. And on their way back south, they passed Hebron. That's where Abraham was buried in a cave, and cut a large cluster of grapes. If you remember, there was some pretty nice orchards there. It was in the valley of Eshcol. Eshcol means cluster. And before returning 40 days to the Israelite camp at Kadesh Barnea in the desert of Paran. So the moment of truth came. Who would they choose? Whose report are they going to choose? And God does allow them to make a choice. God allows all of us to make choices in life. He allows our children to make choices in life. Somebody look up Hebrews 3:17 through 19.
And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the desert? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief.
They didn't believe what God said. And I was thinking too how they were responsible for so much. God makes it very clear that those that have been given much are responsible for much. You think of even Jesus telling the disciples, he says, woe unto you, Chorazin. Woe unto you, Bethsaida. He said, if the miracles had been done, for Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented. And the judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be less than what it is for you. That there is a degree, I don't understand that, how that's working. But there's going to be degrees of judgment. So, Numbers 14 now, verses 1 through 3. Want somebody read that?
Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?
We've heard that story, song and dance before too. Yeah.
The light still hasn't come on.
But isn't that amazing? They cried all night and they wished they had died. Now that's depression. And you think, how did Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb feel at this point? That's why Ron Mancini said he was bald because he kept on going. So they accuse, now this is interesting, they accuse God of bringing them into the land so their children would die. Now that's slander. What they're saying is, God doesn't care about my kids. Ironically, who was it that entered the land? The kids. All of them died, except for Joshua and Caleb.
Well, Moses wasn't ready to enter the land either.
And Moses, right?
All he
Moses
could
didn't
do is see it from a distance.
Right, yep. And we're gonna get to that where the Lord buried him. Okay, we're gonna see a little clip here from about Joshua and Caleb and this whole deal. I think it's, you know, I just think it's so sad. And once again, you know, if there's an enemy from without, it's easier to deal with than when the enemy's from within, which is more serious when the enemy's from within. Diana and I were talking about that. If the enemy's coming from without, you tend to bond together then. And say, we're gonna do this, we're gonna fight this. But if it's coming from within, you fight each other. I don't think this is copyrighted. We can try it.
As the children of Israel continued their journey in the wilderness, they encountered many challenges. Firstly, how to feed that many people. In Exodus 16 is recorded the first account of the miracle of the manna, a miracle that continued every week for the next 40 years. Every day for the first 6 days of the week, manna would fall. Then on the 6th day, they would hold a double portion for the 7th day, the Sabbath. And the part that they held for Sabbath would not go rotten. Then on the Sabbath, no manna would fall. This was all to remind them of the 4th commandment, which says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It was also to teach them to rely on God every day for their temporal needs. They now came to Mount Sinai. There are two competing claims to Mount Sinai. One is in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, and the other is in Saudi Arabia, in what would have been the land of Midian. Mount Sinai is where the Israelites built a golden calf, in what was a terrible episode. As Moses came down from the mountain, he showed his and God's displeasure. Most of the people repented, but 3,000 would not. The children of Israel had a lot to learn after being in slavery for so many generations. As they left Sinai, they journeyed towards Canaan with the pillar of God's presence in front of them. At night, the pillar of cloud would turn to fire, and it was a visible presence that God was leading them. They were led to Kadesh Barnea, today located on the southern border of Israel with Egypt. Moses sent 12 spies into the land. The names of the 12 are recorded in the Bible, but today most people can only name 2 of them. As the 12 spies toured the land, no doubt the people waited in anticipation of a good report so their journey could end. However, when the spies came back, 10 of them gave a negative report. And they said even though the land was good, and it was fruitful, and it did flow with milk and honey, they said the people lived in fortified cities, and we aren't able to take the land. Joshua and Caleb, though, said, we can take the land, and encouraged the people to do so. But 10 of the spies insisted that they couldn't, even referring to themselves as grasshoppers in the sight of these supposed giants. The people now wish they hadn't left Egypt, and Joshua and Caleb tried one last time to convince them. But no matter how hard they tried, their words of encouragement were instead met with people who wanted to stone them with stones. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't reverse the negative and distrustful report that the other spies had brought back. Such doubt and disbelief in the power of God would not be left without consequence. God decreed that all those over the age of 20 must die in the wilderness. In addition to this, for each day that the spies searched the land, they would wander in the wilderness for 1 year. This is one of the places where we get the biblical principle of 1 day equaling a year. The only adults over the age of 20 that this does not apply to is Joshua and Caleb, who manifested tremendous faith and courage, and their names have lived on in history. My favorite part of the story is at the end of the 40 years of wandering when Joshua and Caleb enter the land. Joshua is now the leader of the Israelites, and Caleb is an older man at the age of 87, but he asked to be given the land of the giants. He says in Joshua 14:12, "Give me this mountain. If the Lord be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out." He did not seek an easy retirement, but rather he wanted to show that our strength is not in human power, but it's in the power of God. No matter what our age is or what obstacles lie in our path, when we trust God to deliver us and clear a path before us.
Yeah, so I found this little series very well done. Any comments on that? Something that hit you?
Maybe more just the general thing that there were giants there. It wasn't a cakewalk.
Right.
They had to go to battle. And then just in our own personal lives, you know, problems can become a lot bigger than they need to be. And the other thing was Moses and Caleb had faith, but, you know, individual people needed faith too.
Right. Yeah.
And that just, the leader can't do everything.
Right.
They all gotta pull it apart. The sub-leaders.
I think the other thing, Joshua and Caleb could have become bitter for 40 years. They had to suffer with these
Yeah.
people.
And it
They
doesn't
didn't lose
seem,
their faith.
and it doesn't seem like Caleb did. Caleb, you know, he said, well, I'm ready to go.
Faith.
I think I would have got bitter.
Yeah. Who wouldn't?
What do you mean? I had this spot all picked out, you know, I'm gonna build a 9-hole golf course or whatever. And, yeah, so,
Kind of see some parallel in today's society.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that everybody wants everything given to them. Only more than what.
and I think, you know, one of the things I thought too was that bad report spread throughout the 2 million people. And it's the whole idea too that if you say a lie enough times, people will believe it.
And you're gonna believe it yourself.
Yeah, yeah. But pretty soon, you just think, well, yeah, that's true.
What goes around comes around.
Yeah, yeah. I guess God doesn't care, you know. Let's see, did we go through the Red Sea? So, you know, Joshua and Caleb said, hey, look what God has done already for us. The people of the land don't have a chance against us with God on our side. And the people said, don't confuse us with the facts. Our mind is made up. They weren't going to switch. So they're actually going to stone them, like they said. And you know, true believers do get persecuted throughout the centuries. We see that today. I forget what Barnabas Aid was saying, you know, how many people are martyred every day in the world. It's amazing. So they're ready to stone him. And God says, stop. Nope, that's not going to happen. And his Shekinah glory appears, which was a scary event. I think whenever we saw the Shekinah glory of God in the Bible, it was not like, oh, look at that. It was like, whoa. And so they stopped. God saved their life that way.
I was thinking as I was reading that verse in there, just the Lord getting frustrated with what we were doing. I think, does the Lord get frustrated? Is that an emotion he can have? But it just says, how long will these people spurn me? How are they gonna do this?
Well,
And how long will they not believe me?
God hates sin. You know that, right? Yeah.
But then I was thinking, oh yeah, how many times is he had to say that to us?
Yeah. So God offers Moses now a chance in verses 4 through 9. Which is an interesting thing. He says, I'll make you a great nation. And start over. And Moses says, no, I don't want it. I mean, you gotta remember Moses is in his 80s. It's not like, well, I mean, Abraham had, Isaac in his elderly years, but Moses doesn't want that. Let's read verses, it's a long passage, but maybe I'll read it. It's verses 13 through 19. It's very touching, I think. So why does he say no? And Moses replied, the Egyptians will hear about it. For by your strength you brought up this people from them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, how you, Lord, are seen face to face, how your cloud stands over them, and how you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day, in a pillar of fire by night. If you kill these people with a single blow, the nations will have heard of your fame and will declare, since the Lord wasn't able to bring this people into the land he swore to give them, he has slaughtered them in the wilderness. So now, may my Lord's power be magnified just as you have spoken. The Lord is slow to anger, rich in faithful love, forgiving wrongdoing and rebellion. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's wrongdoing on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the wrongdoing of this people in keeping with the greatness of your faithful love, just as you have forgiven them from Egypt until now. So there's a little litany of the character of God that Moses recites to God. It's not like God doesn't know that, but and the Lord responded, I have pardoned them as you requested. And then, yet as surely as I live, and as the whole earth is filled with the Lord's glory, none of the men who have seen my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt in the wilderness, and have tested me these 10 times, I think we can look back and see a lot of them are recorded, and did not obey me, will ever see the land I swore to give them, their fathers. None of those who despised me will see it. But since my servant Caleb has a different spirit and has followed me completely, I will bring him into the land where he has gone, and his descendants will inherit it. That's an interesting little conversation there with Moses and God. Now, once again, we see Moses as a great intercessor. We saw it with Miriam. We saw it before, too, with the children of Israel. And even Deuteronomy 9:20, I was reading and I thought, well, that's really interesting. Because this isn't recorded, once again, when the Ten Commandments came down and they were worshiping. Because we were wondering, so what about Aaron, Shouldn't he have gotten? And in Deuteronomy 9:20, it says, the Lord was angry enough with Aaron to destroy him. But I prayed for Aaron at that time also. Interesting. We didn't see that in the Numbers account. But here it says, the Lord was going to destroy Aaron. And once again, as an intercessor, Moses prayed for him. You would have think, knowing that too, Aaron, talking to Miriam, should have stuck up. He says, listen, Miriam, I like Moses. I knew you're part of this. He saved me, from being destroyed by his prayers. And, but he didn't. He didn't. And then God goes on, he says, I took the sinful calf you made, burned it up, crushed it thoroughly, grinded it into powder as fine as dust. Then I threw it into the stream that came down from the mountain. It's interesting. So if somebody was panning for gold later on, you could have done something. Okay. So God is gracious. And God's ultimate end game was listed in that verses 20 through 21. All the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. There's a number of verses like that, like in Isaiah. As surely as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of God. That's God's end game. And when we see in Revelation, that's the end. All the earth is going to be filled with the glory of God. And the New Jerusalem's coming down to earth, and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, and there'll be no need for sun because the Lord's. You'll be the light. And it says there'll be no oceans. I don't know. So, and the bottom line too is God keeps his covenant. God in his foreknowledge, he knew all this was going to happen. He knew that Moses would pray. He knew that the people would do that. And they were going to spend 40 more years in the wilderness. Verses 22 through 24, we read that too. God says, there's no excuse. They've tempted me 10 times the same way with rebellion. Now, we should make a little note here. It's not done yet. And not only as they're going into the land, you get into the book of Judges, and what happens? There's the cycle. Same thing. But God is faithful. I forget who was saying it, some world leader, he says, the proof of God's existence is the nation of Israel. Where are the Moabites today? Where are all these other people? They're gone. But God is and they haven't had an easy time of it through the persecutions, the Holocaust, and yet they're still there. And I think the rule still applies too. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And some nations have learned the hard way that's true. You look what happened to Germany. Look what happened to Russia. And there's the story about Harry Truman, how he kind of decided that he was going to support Israel's nationhood. That was a feather in the cap of America that he did that. In the war, in the 6-day war, Nixon, Kissinger, he said, what are we going to do? And Nixon said he remembered the Bible stories when as a child growing up a Quaker, and his mom said, someday you're going to help Israel. And he took that and he said, yeah, we're going to help them. We're going to send supplies and protect them from the people there, the enemies. Okay. So once again, like I said, that too much is given, much is required. And then I love that verse there. It says, and Caleb had a different spirit. May that be, of all of us, that he seems to have been really a remarkable man. mean, and then to have the gumption to say, that's what Chuck Swindoll, but he's kind of coined that word, having gumption. Caleb certainly had gumption, and he wasn't fearful. Okay, so verses 29 through 32, the judgment comes. Anybody 20 years and up. That's interesting, 20 years, that is the Bible saying that sets the age of accountability? You always talk about when your amygdala develops and why you can't trust a teenager because their common sense part of their brain isn't developed yet. And boys, it takes longer than girls. So. But
Some people in their 80s still haven't.
their amygdala doesn't.
In verse 29, it even looks like God looked at the census. Any number that's listed in the census from 20 years old and upward will be grumbled against. So that was the cutoff point. But God, they have a census evidently of
Yeah,
all the people.
601,000 men. But I don't think it included just the men, I think.
No.
It was, everybody was accountable.
Maybe some of those under 20 grumbled a little bit, but they were too
But
young.
their amygdala wasn't.
Yeah,
So,
right.
yeah.
Was there because just what you read there, according to your complete number from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me? Does that mean there were some who had grumbled and they wouldn't get?
Well, I think the Bible indicates later that the only two that made it were Joshua and Caleb of that generation.
20 no matter what.
Yeah, and they must have all grumbled.
Apparently. That's what he
And
said.
like they said, that word spread.
Yeah.
Hey, did you hear? The spies came back? And they said there's giants in the land. I'm not going. No, wait, I'm going back to Egypt. It's a long ways back to Egypt. And I don't think Egypt was going to be real helpful if you came back. Yeah. Oh, great, you're coming back. We have all these social services for you. Get out of
The Red Sea
here.
again, too.
What was that?
They'd have to go through the Red Sea again.
Right.
And who's going to be helping there?
Right, they'd have to take bullets.
Yeah, right.
Make some quotes.
And sometimes it's like that which is in the past, after it's been many years, looks like it was better than it really was.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
Yeah, the good old days aren't necessarily the good old days. I mean, many of us will think back in the 1950s, that those were the good old days, but there were a lot of bad things in the good old days, too. I mean, my daughter tells me, she says, yeah, the good old days, but it wasn't good for everybody.
I can remember my parents talking about their good old days.
During the Depression.
Yeah.
Gospel, stock market crash.
Right.
Yep.
I read something that my uncle had written, he wrote up some stuff about his growing up and going through the time of learning how to fly and all that kind of stuff. He wrote something there, a letter back to my grandfather about what's happening. My grandfather wrote a letter back and it's talked about what was happening in these things with us holding. I had never read that before, until here sometime this last year, I read kind of not so good. They had to sell things and cattle and stuff.
My mother-in-law said as a girl that her mom the men would shoot rabbits, and then they'd make rabbit pie. She said she didn't like it. But that was, I read that some other place too, that it's pretty common, that the rabbits kind of flourish, so that was a source of meat.
Quail.
Didn't have to kill the fatted cow.
It was their quail.
Oh, and they put in squirrel meat. We used to have squirrel in the
Oh, squirrel,
house.
sure.
And broccoli's.
Not a lot of meat on squirrel.
So you better have sharp teeth to if you're gonna eat a squirrel.
Yeah. I had a friend that said when he grew up in Iowa, that they would hunt possum and eat that. He said, boy, since that was greasy, that wasn't any good. So, Okay, well, real quick, we'll kind of finish up a little bit on 14. So then ironically, 40 days spying the land, then symbolically that makes, it will be 40 years, a year for every day that they spent spying out the land. And then the men that spied the land, that gave the false report, they died of the plague. Now that was a red flag to everybody.
Did that happen within a few days?
Yeah, I think that happened almost right away. And then, and we'll probably cover more of this next week, but when the people heard the consequences, this is interesting. Now, they were sad about the consequences, I think. They weren't sad and repentant of the sin. I think that's an important thing, I think anyways. So they mourned. And the lesson there is sometimes God will forgive, but we still pay the consequences for our sin. And then the people said, you know what? We're ready to go now. So we're going to go. And Moses said, no, don't do it. It will not work now. You had your chance, and you didn't take advantage of it. So they went out anyways, and another red flag would have been Moses didn't go with them, the ark didn't go with them, the priests, and they, in their delusion, they thought, we can do it. Like, I mean, it's kind of a holdover from, we don't need God. Well, they weren't ready to face those armies by themselves. And they got their tails whipped. They came back all beaten, bloody, some dead. And it shows, like I said, they were probably really not sorry. And that happens, you know, I'm sure that happened with your own kids. Happens in school a lot where a kid gets disciplined. They're sorry that now they have to pay the price, not that they're sorry for what they did. So without the Lord fighting for them, it was hopeless. And that was going to be a continual theme. If the Lord wasn't with them, they weren't going to win. And we saw that even once they're in the land, and Joshua says, well, we'll go take this little city Ai over here. We'll do it. No problem. We just took Jericho. There's a little town here. And they got their tails whipped again. And Joshua said, oh Lord, what's wrong? And he says, and God said, get up. You know, there's sin in the camp. And they didn't ask permission. They didn't ask guidance for when the Gibeonites came. And they had the moldy bread and the raggedy clothes. We've come a long ways. They never asked God, it's recorded, should we make this treaty with them? They thought, yeah, that sounds pretty good. These guys, they're nice guys. And they found out, oh, they just live next door. And you got to give those guys credit, though. I mean, that was a smart move because, and then when they got attacked by the other native nations, you know, they sent word back to Joshua saying, hey, you know what? You made a covenant with us. Joshua said, yeah, we did. And God said, yeah, you did. You go fight for him. So we'll get in. We're going to kind of skip Numbers 15. If you want to read Numbers 16, another little period of rebellion. And not just the people this time, the general people. There's some real leaders that once again say, hey, what's with Moses here? He's no better than me. God says, yeah, it is. So let's start that next week. So thanks for coming. And, so we'll go, I think, a couple more weeks. Well, the last Wednesday in May. will be our last one. And we'll start, the offering. Okay, so